My name is Joanne Froggatt, and I am 31 years old. I used to think I was the kind of person who could tell the difference between someone who loved me and someone who needed me. I used to think those were two very different things. I know better now, but knowing better doesn't make the knowing feel good. It just makes it quieter, like a song you've heard so many times you stop noticing you're humming it. The morning I found out, I was standing in my kitchen making coffee, not because I needed the caffeine, but because I needed something to do with my hands. I'd been awake since 4. The apartment was still dark and I hadn't turned the lights on yet, and I remember thinking that the blue light from my phone looked like something from a hospital. Cold, precise, indifferent to whatever you were feeling when you looked at it. The message was still open on my screen. I hadn't replied, I hadn't deleted it. I had just stood there in the dark in my socks watching the coffee drip. I need to back up because this story doesn't make sense without the before, and the before was for a long time actually good. That's the part people don't want to hear because it complicates the narrative. You can't just say she was terrible and I was naive. That's not what happened. What happened was something much slower, much softer, and infinitely harder to explain. I moved to Manchester when I was 25, left a small town in Shropshire where everyone knew everyone and nothing ever changed, where my mum still ironed tea towels and my dad watched the same 3 DVDs every weekend. I don't say that with cruelty. I loved that life for what it was. I just needed something else. I'd spent 3 years freelancing as a graphic designer from my childhood bedroom, building a small but solid client base, and I'd saved enough to take a chance on the city. My flat was on the 4th floor of a converted textile building in Ancoats. High ceilings, exposed brick, one window that faced north and got almost no light, but had a beautiful view of the canal if you leaned at exactly the right angle. I loved it. I made it mine in the way you do when you're young and finally living alone for the first time. Plants on every surface, prints I'd designed myself on the walls, a bookshelf that was less about reading and more about who I wanted to be seen as. I worked from home mostly. I had a proper desk set up in the corner of the living room. I did branding work mostly for small businesses, cafes, independent clothing brands, a few interior design firms. I was good at it. Not in a bragging way, just in the way where clients came back, referred their friends, and occasionally sent handwritten notes, which I kept in a shoebox under my bed like a sentimental idiot. The work I was most proud of was a passion project I'd started about a year after moving. I called it Thread and Grain. It was a design journal, part portfolio, part creative archive, part very personal way of documenting the visual language I was developing. I posted new work there regularly. Essays about design philosophy, process shots, sketches, finished pieces. It grew slowly, then less slowly. By the time I turned 28, I had a small but genuinely engaged following. Brands started reaching out. A few minor editorial features happened. I was building something that was entirely, unambiguously mine. That's when I met Cara. She moved into the flat directly below mine in November. I know it was November because the heating in our building was unreliable, and she knocked on my door to ask if mine was also broken. It was. We ended up standing in the hallway for 20 minutes talking about it, and then she said she was making soup if I wanted some, and I said yes before I'd even thought about it. Cara was funny. That's the first thing, not performed funny, not trying to impress funny. She was quick and dry and occasionally a little cutting, but never in a way that felt mean. She worked in marketing for a mid-sized tech company. She was 30, a year older than me, and she'd moved to Manchester after a relationship ended in London. She didn't talk about the relationship much, just said it had run its course, and I respected that because I'm also someone who doesn't particularly enjoy dissecting old pain in front of near strangers. We started spending time together the way you do when you live in the same building and have compatible schedules. Casual at first, coffee on weekend mornings, the occasional walk along the canal, then more deliberately. Dinners, long evenings in one of our flats with wine and conversation that lasted until midnight. She met my other friends, I met her colleagues. We became, in the way I had not quite managed to become with anyone else in that city, genuinely close. She knew about Thread and Grain, of course. I talked about it the way you talk about something that matters to you when you're comfortable with someone. She was always enthusiastic, always interested. She'd ask about specific pieces, share things I'd posted, suggest collaborations. I thought she was just being a good friend. I thought that was what support looked like. Here is where I have to be honest about something. I was, during this period, going through a quiet kind of grief that I hadn't properly named yet. My dad had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's the previous year. He was managing it, Things were stable, but something had shifted in the way I understood time and permanence. I was working harder and feeling it less. I was putting more into thread and grain because it felt like proof that I existed, that I was making something that would outlast the uncertainty that had moved into the background of my daily life without asking. I don't say this to explain what happened. I say it because it's part of the truth, and the truth is the only thing I have left to be careful with. There was a woman I used to see at the cafe I worked from on Tuesday mornings. Nell. I only know her name because I overheard the barista use it once. She was older, maybe 60, always alone, always with a paperback and a pot of tea. She had the look of someone who had been beautiful in a particular, unconventional way and still was, just differently. She never used a laptop. She wrote in a physical notebook with a fountain pen. I noticed her the way you notice quiet, self-contained people who seem entirely comfortable in their own company. One Tuesday in February, I was having a genuinely bad day. My laptop had frozen, and I'd lost 3 hours of work on a rebrand project. The client was due a first draft by Friday, and I'd spilled coffee on the printed reference sheets I'd spread across the table. I was sitting there trying not to cry in a public place, holding a soggy page and feeling like everything was slightly too much. Nell looked over at me, I don't know why, maybe I made a sound, maybe she was just perceptive. She looked at me for a moment with an expression that wasn't pity, exactly, more like recognition, and then she reached into her bag and slid a small bar of dark chocolate across the table between us without saying anything. I stared at it. She had already gone back to her book. I ate the chocolate. It was one of those very good ones, 70%, slightly bitter. I saved the wrapper in my coat pocket without thinking about why. I finished the day, recovered most of the work from an old autosave, sent the draft on Thursday. I didn't think much about it afterward. It was just a small strange kindness from a stranger, and the day moved on. The first time something felt wrong, I couldn't name it. That's always how it starts, isn't it? Not a siren, not a sign, just a frequency that's slightly off, a note held a beat too long. It was spring. Thread and Grain had recently been featured in a design newsletter with a modest but respected following, and off the back of that I'd been approached by a sustainable fashion startup called Linen and Law. They wanted a full brand identity. Logo, typography, color palette, brand guidelines, packaging direction. It was the biggest project I'd been offered. The budget was real money. The brief was exciting. I said yes immediately and spent the next 2 weeks in a state of focused, almost joyful intensity. I talked to Cara about it constantly. I showed her early sketches. I explained my thinking about the visual language I was developing, the connection between natural fibers and handwritten forms, the idea of the brand feeling like something found rather than manufactured. She was enthusiastic, asked good questions. I assumed she was just engaged because she was my friend and I was excited. The project took 6 weeks. I delivered it in May. The client loved it, used phrases like transformative and exactly what we didn't know we needed. They paid quickly, referred 2 other businesses to me within the month, and posted about the collaboration on their Instagram with a write-up that mentioned Thread and Grain and my name. And then about 3 weeks later, Cara mentioned casually that she'd been developing a freelance creative consultancy on the side, that she'd been working on it for a while, that she had a first client. I said that was great, I meant it. But then she said the client was in sustainable fashion, and something cold moved through me and then disappeared before I could catch it. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the world was full of sustainable fashion brands and the overlap meant nothing. Cara was in marketing, she had her own skills, she had every right to build something for herself. I was projecting insecurity, feeling threatened for no reason, making a story out of a coincidence. I kept telling myself that for the next 4 months. In September, Cara told me she'd been invited to present at a small but well-regarded creative conference in Leeds. She was nervous about it, she said. It was her first real public thing. Would I help her prepare? I said yes. Of course I said yes. We spent 3 evenings at her kitchen table going through her presentation. She was presenting on the intersection of craft aesthetics and sustainable brand identity. The language she was using was familiar in the way that something you've written yourself is familiar. I told myself that was because we talked so much about my work that her thinking had naturally absorbed some of my vocabulary. That's what happens when 2 people are close. Thinking bleeds. I helped her structure the presentation. I gave her feedback on the visual slides. I watched her practice it in her living room and told her she was brilliant, and she looked so genuinely relieved and grateful that I felt guilty for the small tight thing that had been sitting in my chest for months. The night before the conference, she hugged me for a long time at my door and said she didn't know what she'd do without me. I believed her. I didn't go to the conference. I had a client call that morning and then my dad rang in the afternoon, a longer call than usual, and by the evening I was tired in the particular way of days that hold too much feeling. I followed along a little on Instagram. Cara had tagged the conference account. People were responding warmly. It was a week later that someone sent me a message. Her name was Priya. She was a designer I'd met briefly at an event in Manchester the previous year, not a close contact, just someone I'd exchanged details with and occasionally followed online. Her message was careful, considerate. She said she didn't want to overstep, but she'd been at the Leeds conference and she'd seen Cara present, and she wanted me to know that Cara had presented work that looked, in Priya's words, almost identical to the thread and grain visual language and the linen and law project. That Cara had spoken about it as her own creative development, that she hadn't mentioned my name once. I read the message 3 times, then I put my phone face down on the desk and sat very still for a while. I didn't cry, not then. I just sat there in the dark of the early evening, listening to the building settle around me, and felt the floor of something give way. Here is the part that is hardest to explain without sounding like I'm catastrophizing, which I'm not, because the worst part wasn't the conference. The conference was just the moment the pattern became undeniable. When I started looking backward with the clarity that betrayal gives you, everything rearranged itself. I went through the timeline. I thought about all the conversations where I'd explained my thinking, shown early sketches, walked through my creative rationale in the specific way you do with someone you trust completely. I thought about the sustainable fashion client, the vocabulary in her presentation, the way she'd always been so particularly interested in thread and grain, not just supportively but specifically, asking about process, methodology, the thinking behind aesthetic choices. I found on the website for Cara's new consultancy a case study. The client was not Linen and Law, the name had been changed, but the visual work shown was unmistakably derivative of the brand identity I'd built. The color palette was slightly shifted, the typography was different, but the conceptual DNA, the logic of the visual language, the specific approach to craft-influenced branding I had spent years developing, it was all there, translated but recognizable. Like someone had put my work through a filter and presented the output as their own. There was a longer write-up on her website under the heading My Creative Philosophy. I read it slowly. Certain phrases landed with physical weight, the idea of brand identity feeling found rather than manufactured, the connection between natural fibers and handwritten form, the language of thread and grain. The exact thinking I'd articulated to her across 2 years of evenings and kitchen tables and long walks. She had not stolen my work directly. She was too careful for that. What she had stolen was something harder to name and harder to prove. She had taken my thinking, my creative language, my years of developing a particular way of seeing and making, and she had presented it to a room full of people as the product of her own mind. I didn't confront her immediately. Part of me wanted to. A larger part of me needed to know how far it went before I said anything. I spent 2 weeks being very quiet and very methodical. I gathered what I could. I saved screenshots, archived pages, compiled a document of dates and overlaps and specific linguistic echoes. I was not functioning well during this time. I was sleeping badly, eating inconsistently, moving through client work with a kind of hollow efficiency. I cancelled plans twice, claiming deadlines. I could not sit across from her and pretend. My dad called during this period. One of our usual conversations, how's work, how's the flat, how's Manchester treating you? He asked if I was all right, and I said yes, and he said, are you sure? And I said, I'm just tired. He said in that specific parent way, the one that doesn't push but leaves a door open, that I could always come home for a weekend if I needed a reset. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. I found the chocolate wrapper in my coat pocket by accident that same week. I'd forgotten it was there. I held it for a moment, this small ridiculous thing I'd carried around for months without knowing why, and I had the strangest feeling of being seen by something that couldn't see. I know that doesn't make sense. I can only tell you that's what it felt like. The conference where Cara had presented was running a follow-up online event in November. A panel discussion. She had been invited back as one of the speakers. A smaller panel, 4 people, but the audience was industry connected, and this time it was being live streamed. I knew she would be presenting work again. I knew the language she would use. I registered to attend. I also, in the week before the event, quietly reached out to the conference organizer. I explained that I was a designer whose work had been presented without attribution at the September event. I was professional, factual, unemotional. I included my documentation, dates, thread and grain archives, the linen and law project, the overlaps, the timeline. I wasn't asking them to do anything dramatic. I said I thought they should be aware and that I would be attending the November event. The organizer replied within 24 hours. She had, she said, pulled the recording from September. She had looked at the documentation. She wanted to speak further before the November event. We had a call. She was careful and professional, and at the end of the call she said she appreciated me being thorough and that she would be making some additions to the event format. I didn't know exactly what that meant. I didn't ask. The panel event was on a Thursday evening. I watched it on my laptop at my desk, the north-facing window dark behind me, a cup of tea I'd forgotten about going cold beside the keyboard. There were 4 panelists. Cara was the third to speak. She looked confident. She looked, sitting in that frame in her good blazer with her hair just so, exactly like someone who had earned her place in the room. I had spent so long loving that quality in her, the self-assurance that I privately found lacking in myself, that watching it now felt like a specific kind of grief. She began to speak about creative philosophy and brand identity. She was about 4 minutes in when the moderator, gently and without drama, asked a question. She said, "There's been some interest from the community in understanding the foundational influences on the approach you've described. Could you speak to the designers and thinkers who have shaped how you work?" There was a pause that lasted maybe 3 seconds. On camera it looked like considered reflection. I knew it was something else. And then, because the moderator was good at her job and had clearly prepared, she mentioned thread and grain by name, said it had been flagged as a significant creative reference in the work Cara had presented in September, asked if Cara wanted to speak to that connection. Cara's face didn't collapse. She was too composed for that. But something in it tightened, recalibrated, and in the half-second before she answered I saw her understand exactly what was happening. She said that she had of course been influenced by many designers including Joanne Froggatt, that thread and grain was a body of work she deeply admired, that she should have been clearer in September about the influences on her thinking. It was not a full admission, it was not the apology I might have wanted, but it was her saying my name in front of that audience in that context, linking my work to the ideas she had presented as her own. The chat was moving. People were searching my name. Someone posted a link to thread and grain. Someone else asked a pointed question that did not get answered. I watched the rest of the panel with both hands wrapped around my cold tea. She texted me that night. The message said, "I think we need to talk." I didn't reply until the following morning. I said, "Yes, we do." We met at a cafe, not the one I usually worked from, somewhere neutral. She arrived looking like she had not slept. I had slept better than I had in weeks, which surprised me when I woke up and noticed it. She apologized. The apology was real and it was also insufficient, and both those things were true at the same time. She said she had not intended it to become what it became, that it had started as her internalizing ideas from our conversations and she hadn't, in the beginning, recognized how far she drifted from influence into something else, that she should have credited me publicly from the beginning, that she was sorry. I listened to all of it. I did not cry. I did not shout. I asked her one question. I asked, "Did you know at the conference in September that the work you were presenting had come substantially from mine?" She looked at her coffee for a moment. She said yes. I nodded. I said thank you for being honest about that. We sat for a little while longer, and then I said I needed some time, and she said she understood, and I paid for my own coffee and left. Here is the thing I didn't know until afterward, the thing that changed the shape of everything when I found it out. About a month after our meeting, I received a message from Cara's younger sister, who I'd met twice and had no real relationship with. The message was long and slightly hesitant, and she explained that she wasn't sure if it was her place to say anything. But she felt I deserved to know something about why Cara was the way she was. Their mother, she said, had been a painter, a serious one with real ability who had spent their whole childhood making work that never quite got the recognition it deserved. She had struggled financially, struggled emotionally, and when Kara was 14, she had been offered a small residency in a different city. She had gone, she had stayed, she had eventually not come back. Kara and her sister had been raised largely by their father from that point, and Kara had grown up with this central, formative understanding of what it meant to put your creative work above the people around you, what it cost, who got left. She had spent her adult life, her sister said, doing the opposite, not making the thing, taking the thing that was already made, staying safe, staying close, never being the one who left. I read that message in my kitchen, in the dark, in the same place I'd been standing the morning this all began, and I felt something loosen in me that I hadn't known was clenched. It didn't make what she did acceptable. I want to be precise about that. Understanding why someone hurts you is not the same as forgiving it, and forgiving it is not the same as returning to it. I have not been back to her flat since that cafe meeting. We don't speak regularly. That part of my life is over in the way certain parts of your life just end, without resolution, without ceremony, in the middle of a Tuesday. But something in me that had been sitting in anger shifted into something quieter, something more like sorrow. For her mother, for the version of creativity she'd inherited that was defined by scarcity and risk and abandonment, for all the ways people damage what they love because they are afraid of what love costs. Thread and Grain is still going. I updated it the week after the panel event, posted a long piece about the Linen and Law project, about that year of work, about what it meant to me. I didn't mention Kara by name. I didn't need to. The people who had seen the panel event understood the context. New people found the journal. A few brands reached out. I go to that cafe on Tuesday morning still. Nell was there last month, same table, same pot of tea, same self-contained stillness. I almost said something. I didn't. Some things are worth more as they are. My dad is doing all right. Not better exactly, the progression is what it is, but stable, present, still watching his 3 DVDs and still ironing things that don't need ironing. I went home for a weekend in January. We sat in the garden one afternoon even though it was cold with tea and biscuits, and he asked about work and I told him the real version, not the edited one I usually give. He listened all the way through and then he said, "Well, you built it, didn't you?" And he meant the work, I think, but I also think he meant me. I'm not the same person I was before all of this. I'm not sure I'm a better one. I'm a more accurate one, maybe. I know now what it feels like to have something taken from you that cannot be given back. I know what it feels like to sit quietly with evidence and wait, and to decide that truth, when it comes, can come without cruelty. I know that the smallest thing, a bar of chocolate slid across a table by a stranger who owed me nothing, can sit in your pocket for months and mean something when you finally understand what it was. I think about Kara sometimes, not with the particular ache I expected, but with something more like the feeling you get when you drive past a town you used to live in. Recognition, distance, the knowledge that it was real and that it was also finished. I think about her mother too, the painter who left, who chose the work and lost the daughter. I don't know if she was right or wrong. I don't know if there's a version of that story where everyone gets what they need. Maybe there isn't. Maybe some of the most important things we carry were never ours to keep. The coffee is on. The window is starting to lighten. It is Tuesday and I have work to do, and somewhere in a building in this city, a woman is opening a book with a fountain pen beside her tea, and I am still here making something with my name on it. That feels like enough.